Imagine a single, 2-cent microchip getting delayed at some crowded port halfway across the globe.
Right, just a tiny piece of silicon.
Exactly. I mean, it seems utterly insignificant, right? Piece of plastic the size of your fingernail. But within exactly 72 hours, a billion-dollar auto assembly line in Detroit just grinds to a dead halt.
Yeah, the workers are sent home. The finished car inventory drops.
Right. The quarterly projections are totally missed, and suddenly the stock price takes a hit. All because of a 2-cent piece of material sitting on the wrong side of the ocean. That is, it's the razor's edge of global supply chain management.
It really is the ultimate butterfly effect. You know, the modern multinational corporation is this marvel of efficiency, but that efficiency comes at the cost of immense fragility.
Oh, absolutely.
When you strip away all the buffer zones to save money, every single link in the chain becomes load-bearing.
And that's precisely why we're here today. I want to warmly welcome you, the listener, specifically you, the MBA student, gearing up for your final exams. We know you aren't just looking to, memorize a neat stack of flashcards.
Definitely not. You need the underlying logic.
Right. Because if you're an executive proposing a massive offshore manufacturing shift, the board of directors isn't going to ask you for the textbook definition of logistics. They're going to ask you to quantify the friction of border rail gauges against the variable cost savings of outsourcing.
They want the mental models. They want to see how you think.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to take your source material, specifically Unit 13 Supply Chain Management for MNCs, and really just arm you with that strategic toolkit. We're going to follow the life cycle of a product from the literal dirt all the way to the boardroom make versus buy showdown.
Yeah, we need to build a holistic framework first. Because before a firm can even begin to debate whether they should, set up shop in India or China.
Or whether they should use a subsidiary versus a contract manufacturer.
Right, exactly. Before any of that, they fundamentally have to map the circulatory system of their own product. If you don't understand how the blood flows, you're basically guilty of corporate malpractice.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So let's trace that blood flow. The foundational architecture here rests on a distinction that people, frankly, mix up constantly. Supply chain management versus logistics.
Oh, all the time. It's the most common mistake.
Let's define the boundaries, but let's do it practically for the exam. Let's use an electric vehicle, the EV, as our proxy. A supply chain is defined as the complete macro-level system.
The whole ecosystem.
Right. It's the organizations, the people, the activities, the resources that pull a product from the raw earth all the way to the final consumer's driveway.
Exactly. The supply chain is the entire universe of value addition. So for an EV, the supply chain starts with the mining companies, right? Extracting lithium in South America or cobalt in Africa.
Then it moves to the refiners.
Yeah, it includes the independent chemical processors, the battery cell assemblers, the tire manufacturers, all the way up to the dealership network actually handing the keys to the buyer. It's the overarching ecosystem.
Okay, that makes sense. And then we have logistics, which the source explicitly defines as a subset of that universe. It involves the specific activities of moving and storing things within the production process. Procurement, distribution, the physical flow.
Right, logistics is the physical manifestation of the chain.
But here's where I think a lot of students get tripped up. Okay, let's unpack this. Because when we hear logistics, we picture a guy with a clipboard standing next to a forklift.
A warehouse with pallets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But looking at the 8 key processes of global supply chain management from the text, half of them don't sound like moving boxes at all. Number 1 is customer relationship management. Number 2 is customer service management. Number 3 is demand management. How do those dictate logistics?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, logistics is entirely driven by the pull of the consumer. It's about lowest cost combined with maximum customer satisfaction. Let's look at the mechanism here, specifically through the lens of demand management. Have you ever heard of the bullwhip effect?
Oh, the bullwhip effect. Remind me how that works in this context.
The bullwhip effect happens when a really tiny fluctuation in customer demand causes massive cascading disruptions up the supply chain. So if an auto manufacturer incorrectly forecasts demand, say they predict they need 10,000 EVs, but they actually only sell 2,000.
That's a huge miss. What happens?
Total chaos. The dealership lot is full. The regional warehouse is suddenly choked with dead inventory. The factory has to halt the assembly line. The battery supplier is left holding a highly volatile chemical stock that degrades over time.
Wow.
Yeah, your entire physical logistics network basically collapses under the weight of inaccurate data.
So the physical trucks and warehouses are just the tail of the dog, and demand forecasting is the dog itself.
Precisely. And it ties directly into customer relationship and customer service management. If your brand promises a premium white glove delivery experience within 40 hours of ordering a custom EV,
Your whole system has to support that.
right, your physical logistics network must be architected backward from that exact promise. You can't rely on slow ocean freight for replacement parts. You need distributed, localized warehousing and high-speed final mile delivery. This service agreement dictates the warehouse location.
Okay, that makes the first three processes incredibly clear for the listener. Then we get to the operational core of the 8 processes. Order fulfillment, manufacturing flow management, and procurement. Those are a bit more intuitive.
Yeah, those are the nuts and bolts.
Right. Procurement is securing the lithium at the right price. Manufacturing flow is making sure the chassis meets the battery at the exact right second on the assembly line. Order fulfillment is getting the car on the carrier truck to the buyer.
Very straightforward.
But then the source lists product development and commercialization as the 7th logistics process. Come on, product development. That's, the design team drawing sleek lines in a studio. How is that logistics?
It's actually a really vital concept called designing for logistics, because the aesthetic design of a product radically alters how efficiently it can be moved. The classic example here isn't a car. It's an IKEA chair.
Ooh, the flat back stuff.
Exactly. The product development team at IKEA doesn't just design a chair that looks good and is comfortable. They design a chair that can be broken down completely flat. Why? Because shipping air is the fastest way to bankrupt a supply chain.
That makes so much sense. You're trying to eliminate empty space.
Right. By designing a flat pack chair, they can fit 10,000 units into a standard shipping container instead of, say, 1,000 fully assembled units. So the product design phase exponentially decreases the global transportation cost.
That's a great mental model for the exam. The design phase dictates the geometry of the cargo. And finally, the 8th process, returns management, which is reverse logistics.
Which is arguably the most complex part of the whole operation. Moving a product forward is a standardized process. Moving a defective, used, or damaged product backward through the chain is incredibly chaotic.
Especially with something like an EV battery.
Exactly. If an EV battery has a thermal runaway issue, how do you safely transport a massive, potentially explosive battery back across the country for analysis? How a company handles that reverse flow really dictates their profitability and brand survival.
So if you're answering an essay question on logistics, you have to look past the forklifts. You have to illustrate this 8-part organism. You show how demand forecasting prevents dead inventory and how product design maximizes container space.
You show the professor, you see the whole board.
Right. But eventually the product does have to physically move. And that brings us to the fundamental economic trigger of global trade. I like to call it the golden rule of trade. The battle between transportation cost and the national price difference.
This is the absolute bedrock of international business. If you don't get this, you don't get supply chains. The equation is elegant. You look at the cost to produce an item in your home country. Then you look at the cost to produce it abroad.
And that delta, that gap, is the national price difference.
Yes. But to capture that savings, you have to physically move the goods across the globe, which incurs transportation costs, freight, insurance, warehousing, and the interest tied up in transit.
So the rule of thumb for the exam is, if the transportation cost is greater than the national price difference, you stay home. You produce domestically.
Exactly. It doesn't matter if labor in another country is 90% cheaper. If the product is so heavy or fragile that it costs a fortune to ship, you lose money.
But if the price difference is greater than the transport cost, you trade internationally. You go global.
You have to. And this equation forces businesses into 2 distinct categories that dictate where they place their factories. We have resource-oriented industries and market-oriented industries.
Let's unpack those, because getting this wrong on a case study is a fatal error. Let's start with resource-oriented industries. They locate their facilities near the raw materials. Why? Because the raw inputs are much heavier, bulkier, or costlier to move than the finished product.
Think of a steel mill. You don't mine thousands of tons of heavy iron ore in Australia, load raw dirt onto ships, sail it to New York, and then extract the tiny percentage of usable steel.
You'd be paying to ship mostly waste.
Exactly. The transport cost of the waste material would ruin you. So you put the massive, energy-intensive smelting facility right next to the mine, you refine it locally, and you only ship the lighter, high-value finished steel beams across the ocean.
That makes perfect sense. Conversely, market-oriented industries locate their facilities as close to the final consumer as possible. because in these industries, the finished product is heavier, more fragile, or more expensive to transport than the raw materials.
The quintessential example here is soft drinks.
Oh, like soda syrup.
Right. The raw input, the flavored syrup, is highly concentrated, incredibly cheap, and easy to ship globally in large vats. But once you mix it with local water and put it into fragile glass bottles or aluminum cans, it becomes incredibly heavy and voluminous.
So you don't bottle soda in Atlanta and ship it to Tokyo.
Never. You ship the syrup to Tokyo and build the bottling plant right outside the city limits.
So for the listener, if a case study asks you to recommend a factory location for a new product line, your opening argument must define whether the product is resource-oriented or market-oriented. You have to prove you understand the geometry and weight dynamics of what you're selling.
Because once you establish that, you have to figure out if the country you've chosen can actually handle the physical movement of your goods. You have to analyze the infrastructure.
Right, which brings us to the LPI, the Logistics Performance Index, generated by the World Bank. The source cites 2016 data, grading countries on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the best.
It's a crucial metric for MNCs.
So the data shows Germany ranked number 1 with a 4.23. The USA was 10th at 3.99, and India ranked 38th with a 3.42. Now, on paper, the difference between a 4.23 and a 3.42 doesn't sound like much. I mean, it's less than a single point. But what does that friction actually look like on the ground?
Oh, that fraction of a point represents billions of dollars in lost efficiency. The LPI measures the quality of trade infrastructure. So we're talking about the efficiency of customs clearance, the quality of ports, the predictability of trace and track IT systems.
So what's a 4.23 look like?
A 4.23 in Germany means a shipping container lands in Hamburg, clears automated customs in minutes, gets loaded directly onto a high-speed rail line, and reaches a factory with mathematical precision.
And India's 3.42.
A 3.42 in India, historically speaking, means that same container might sit at the port for days awaiting physical paperwork stamps. Then it gets loaded onto a truck that has to navigate congested, poorly maintained roads, which makes just-in-time manufacturing virtually impossible.
Wow. And let's dive into those specific modes of transportation, starting with land. Land is split between roads and railways. Roads are vital for short-distance, door-to-door service. But the source pulls a really fascinating statistic from the 2005 Britannica yearbook regarding road density.
Ah, yes, the density metrics.
Right. It notes that India had a road density of 105 kilometers per 100 square kilometers, whereas Japan had 327. Now, obviously, infrastructure has evolved globally since 2005, but what is the underlying strategic principle that statistic highlights?
Route flexibility. Supply chains require redundancy. If you're operating in a low-density environment and a major highway gets washed out by a monsoon or blocked by a political protest, your trucks simply stop. The factory starves.
But in Japan?
In a high-density environment like Japan, if a highway is blocked, the routing algorithm instantly diverts the truck down 3 alternative, perfectly paved secondary roads. Density equals resilience.
That's a great takeaway. Then we have railways, which are built for heavy, bulky goods over long distances. But it's not as simple as just putting a train on a track. The text gets incredibly specific about rail gauges.
Yes, the literal distance between the wheels.
Right. It talks about broad gauge, which is over 1.5 meters wide, standard gauge at 1.44 meters, meter gauge, narrow gauge. Why on earth does a business student need to know about the distance between train wheels?
Because rail gauges represent hard border friction. Imagine a train loaded with your auto components traveling across Europe. It's rolling smoothly on standard gauge tracks, but then it hits the border of a country that historically uses broad gauge tracks.
And what happens?
The train physically cannot proceed. The wheels won't fit. So what happens? The train stops. Cranes have to be brought in to individually lift hundreds of massive shipping containers off the first train and place them onto a second train.
Wait, really? They lift every single box?
Yeah. Or, in some places, the train cars literally have to be lifted up and have their bogies, the wheel assemblies, mechanically swapped out.
That sounds incredibly expensive.
Hell.
And slow.
It's a massive bleed on efficiency. It adds labor costs, it adds transit days, and every time you lift a container, you increase the risk of dropping or damaging the goods inside. That's why standardizing global infrastructure is such a massive geopolitical advantage.
So land is just full of friction, which is why water transportation remains the absolute backbone of globalization. The text points out it is unequivocally the cheapest method for global transport.
Absolutely. The economies of scale are unmatched.
The massive ocean routes, the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean Indian, combined with shipping canals like the Suez and Panama, literally make the modern world possible.
Without the ultra-low cost of massive Panamax container ships, the entire economic theory of offshoring collapses. If you had to fly goods everywhere, the transportation costs would instantly overwhelm the national price difference we talked about earlier. Water is slow, but it's practically free on a per-unit basis.
And on the complete opposite end of the spectrum is air transport. It's the fastest mode available. The source actually notes that a maximum of 35 hours separates any 2 points on the globe by air.
Right, but it is exorbitantly expensive.
The densest network is in the eastern U.S. But clearly you aren't shipping heavy auto chassis by air.
No, never. Air freight is strictly reserved for high-value, low-weight goods or extreme emergencies. You fly microchips, you fly cutting-edge pharmaceuticals, you fly high fashion.
Or spare parts.
Exactly. Going back to our EV auto plant, if a specialized welding robot breaks down and the assembly line stops, you don't put the replacement part on a ship from Germany and wait 4 weeks. You put it on a chartered jet and fly it over in hours because the cost of the factory being down is millions of dollars a day.
The final mode listed is pipelines, which is entirely limited to liquids and gases, petroleum, natural gas, water. The U.S. has a dense network of oil pipelines. But the source actually lists a milk pipeline. I have to admit that sounds a bit absurd.
It is highly niche, but they do exist in certain ultra-concentrated dairy regions in Europe, moving milk directly from farms to processing plants.
Wow.
It perfectly illustrates the concept of hyper-specialized infrastructure. But the larger takeaway here isn't memorizing milk pipelines. It's understanding that no multinational uses just one mode.
Right, they use a multimodal strategy.
Correct. A lithium battery doesn't just take a ship. It's loaded on a truck at the factory, transferred to a broad-gauge train, moved to a seaport, loaded onto an ocean freighter, unloaded at a U.S. port, onto a standard gauge rail line, and finally put on a specialized final mile delivery truck.
So as an MBA strategist, you have to map that entire journey and identify where the friction points are.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've established the circulatory system. We know how things move. But who actually owns the factories making these things? This takes us right into the boardroom for the ultimate strategic crossroads, the make versus buy decision.
Yes, the make versus buy dilemma.
Which introduces the concept of vertical integration.
This is the absolute core of corporate strategy. Vertical integration is the degree to which a firm owns its upstream suppliers and its downstream buyers.
There are two directions to this: backward integration and forward integration. Let's stick with our EV analogy. Backward integration is when the automaker decides they are tired of negotiating with battery suppliers, so they go out and buy a battery manufacturing company, or they literally buy a lithium mine.
Right. They are reaching backward into their supply chain to control the raw inputs.
And forward integration is when that same automaker bypasses traditional third-party car dealerships and builds their own retail showrooms. They are reaching forward, closer to the final consumer, to control the distribution, the pricing, and the customer experience.
So they own the whole pipeline.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what's the strategic incentive to make everything yourself? The source outlines some massive advantages. It can lower production costs by cutting out the middleman's profit margin. It protects highly specialized investments, like if you have a proprietary battery design, you might not trust a third-party factory to build it correctly.
But the most crucial reason listed is innovation and patent protection.
Let's dwell on this because it's fundamentally about monopoly power.
Oh, absolutely. If you invent a revolutionary new motor and you outsource the manufacturing, you have to hand your blueprints over to a third-party factory. You run an incredible risk that the factory learns how to make your motor, steals the intellectual property, and starts supplying your competitors.
That's terrifying for a business.
It happens all the time. By making it in-house, you protect your patents. In economics, patents grant you a legal monopoly on that specific technology. Monopoly power reduces competition, allowing you to charge premium prices, which directly drives up profitability. Vertical integration builds a fortress around your IP.
But obviously no company can make everything. I mean, Ford used to own sheep farms to make wool for their car seats, but those days are long gone. Companies have to rely on outside help. And this brings us to two terms that students constantly mix up: outsourcing and offshoring.
This is the most common trap on any supply chain exam. The terms are not synonymous, and using them interchangeably will signal to a professor or a board of directors that you lack precision.
Let's draw the hard lines for the listener. Outsourcing is a structural shift. It implies that an organization takes an in-house process, something their own employees used to do, and gives it to an outside, unaffiliated third-party company.
Right. Unaffiliated is the key word.
That third-party company could be located right down the street in your own city, or it could be halfway across the world. The defining factor is that they are unaffiliated. You are contracting outside the boundaries of your firm.
Exactly. You're paying someone else to do the work.
Now, offshoring is a geographic shift. It means replacing a domestic process with an imported process from another country. You are moving the work across a national border to take advantage of lower costs or different skills.
But here is the critical nuance.
Yes, lay it out.
A company can offshore in two different ways. They can offshore to an unaffiliated foreign company, which is offshore outsourcing, or they can build and own their own factory in another country. That is called offshore in-house sourcing.
Okay, wait, let me make sure I have this straight.
The rule is explicit. If the services or manufacturing are supplied by the company's own foreign affiliate or subsidiary, it is not outsourcing.
Why?
Because the parent company maintains ownership of the process. They just change the geographic location of their employees. So if a U.S. tech company builds a customer service center in India and staffs it with their own employees, that is offshoring, but it is not outsourcing.
Okay, so the exam-ready definitions are locked. Outsourcing is about who owns the firm. Offshoring is about where the firm is located.
Perfectly stated.
The source gives examples of standard offshore outsourcing, like Nike and Reebok contracting third-party factories in developing nations for cheap labor, or U.S. telecom companies outsourcing call centers to unaffiliated Indian tech firms.
Classic example.
But how does a manager decide which processes are safe to outsource? I mean, you can't just throw darts at a board.
No, you need an analytical framework. You don't outsource your core competency, and you don't outsource processes that require immense situational adaptability.
And the source provides a brilliant tool for this. The U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO, put out a report in 2004 that outlines a vulnerability test. It's 3 specific criteria that make a business function highly suitable for offshore outsourcing.
It's a great test. Let's hear the criteria.
Number 1, the process has high information content that can be standardized and digitized. Number 2, the job processes can be separated and documented step by step. Number 3, there is no face-to-face customer interaction.
Let's test this framework with a modern gray area example to see how it works in practice for an exam. Let's take telemedicine specifically, a radiologist reading an MRI scan. Should a hospital outsource this?
Okay, let's run the GAO test. Criterion 1. Can the information be standardized and digitized?
Yes, MRI scans are purely digital files that can be sent anywhere instantly.
Criterion 2. Can the process be documented step by step?
Yes, radiological analysis follows a strict, standardized medical protocol.
Criterion 3. Is there face-to-face interaction?
No, the radiologist is sitting in a dark room looking at a screen. They never physically touch the patient.
Therefore, according to the GAO framework, reading MRIs is highly vulnerable to offshore outsourcing. You can have a doctor in Bangalore read a scan from a patient in Boston overnight.
Exactly. Now let's contrast that with bedside nursing. Run the test.
Can the information be completely digitized?
Yep.
No. Assessing a patient's physical color, temperature, and emotional state requires being there.
Right. Can the process be strictly documented step by step?
Sort of, but it requires massive dynamic adaptation if the patient crashes.
Is there face-to-face interaction?
Yes, it's inherently physical.
Therefore, bedside nursing fails the GAO test and cannot be outsourced. If you get an exam question asking whether a firm should outsource legal contract review versus high-level merger negotiations, you run them through those 3 criteria to build an ironclad argument.
It demonstrates that you aren't just guessing based on vibes. You're applying a rigorous mental model to assess risk.
Exactly. It shows you think like a strategist.
So, assuming a firm runs the GAO test and decides, yes, we are going to outsource our software development or our component manufacturing, they have to pick a location. And this leads to the great geographic showdown of the last few decades, China versus India.
Ah, the classic heavyweight bout. When you decide to move operations offshore, you aren't just hunting for the lowest hourly wage. That's a rookie mistake.
What are you looking for then?
You are looking for holistic strategic alignment between your product's needs and the host country's institutional environment.
The source lists the general factors for location selection. You have to evaluate intellectual property rights strength, specifically mentioning the TRIPS agreement, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. That standardized IP protection globally and gave foreign pharma companies the confidence to operate in India.
Huge turning point.
You also look at technical infrastructure, data networks, the weakness of the local currency, government regulations, and cultural or language barriers. But for decades, China and India have been the dual engines of global sourcing. The source references a 2007 study by Kanamori to compare them. Let's start with China.
Okay, based on Katamori, what's the verdict?
According to the study, China's massive edge is in manufacturing high-quality auto components, garments, and electronics at a low cost. But their real superpower is physical logistics. They have poured astronomical capital into roads, railways, and ports, which results in much higher delivery frequency.
Right, the hard infrastructure.
Furthermore, their tax and bureaucratic systems are streamlined to welcome foreign direct investment.
Now, compare that to India's structural advantage. India historically lagged in physical infrastructure due to incredibly dense, complicated bureaucracy and complex tax codes that vary by state.
But they had a different strength.
Yes. India cultivated a massive, highly educated English-speaking workforce that excels in technical skills. Therefore, India's supreme advantage is in IT, software development, and business process outsourcing.
Okay, I have to push back here for the sake of our listener. The Kanamori study is from 2007. We are deep into the 2020s now.
Yeah.
Is it still safe for an MBA student to rely on this rigid binary of China builds the hardware, India writes the software? I mean, India has made massive leaps in physical infrastructure recently with programs like Make in India, and China is a global powerhouse in AI and software development. Isn't this dichotomy a bit outdated?
That's a highly sophisticated observation, and you're right that the lines have blurred significantly. Both nations are aggressively trying to encroach on the other's territory.
Right.
However, infrastructure creates an immense macroeconomic hangover. It takes decades to shift the structural gravity of a massive economy. While India is building factories, China still retains an overwhelming incumbent advantage in high-speed, multimodal physical supply chains.
So the roots run deep.
Exactly. And while China develops AI, India still maintains an unparalleled scale of English-fluent, technically trained labor optimized for global service integration. So, for the purposes of a strategic exam model, the fundamental archetypes still hold true.
So the shorthand remains strategically valid. If you have a case study about a fast fashion clothing brand where lead times, physical distribution, and port speed are everything, you recommend China.
Yes.
If you're advising a cloud computing startup where physical roads don't matter but standardized digital logic and engineering costs do, you recommend India.
Exactly. China equals hardware and logistics speed. India equals software and labor cost advantage. You align the friction of the country with the needs of the product.
Which brings us to the execution phase. We've picked the country. Now, what legal and operational structure do we actually use to plant the flag? The Force gives us two primary paths: subsidiaries versus contract manufacturing.
This is where strategy meets corporate law. How much control do you demand, and how much risk are you willing to absorb?
Let's start with subsidiaries. A subsidiary is an independent legal entity where the parent firm holds more than 50% of the voting stock. Why go through the headache of setting up a separate company?
Well, the source notes it's for tax benefits, risk diversification, and managing completely different local liabilities.
Right. But if the parent holds 100% of the stock, it's a wholly owned subsidiary. The text says this is the ideal structure if your business strategy demands absolute global standardization.
If you are building a product where a single microscopic defect could cause a lethal failure, like an aircraft engine, or a highly complex automotive drivetrain, you cannot tolerate operational deviance.
You need perfection everywhere.
Yes, you need the factory floor in Ohio to operate with the exact same culture, the exact same tolerances, and the exact same management hierarchy as the factory in Tokyo. You achieve that through a wholly owned subsidiary. You maintain absolute dictatorial control over the process.
And the source illustrates this beautifully with what we can call the Honda Masterclass. Honda Motor Company in Tokyo operates across automotive, aviation, and robotics, but they manage this empire through a sprawling, decentralized web of subsidiaries.
Let's hear the web.
They have American Honda, Honda Auto China, Dongfeng Honda, and Honda Spain for the regional auto markets. They have Honda Airways for aviation, Honda Racing for sports cars, and GE Honda Aero engines for advanced propulsion tech. They isolate the risk into distinct legal buckets.
It's brilliant.
If Honda Racing faces a catastrophic lawsuit, it doesn't legally bankrupt the family sedans in Honda Spain. But the parent company in Tokyo still pulls the strategic strings.
It's a masterclass in compartmentalizing liability while maintaining brand standardization. But creating a wholly owned subsidiary is incredibly capital intensive. You have to buy the land, build the factory, and hire all the workers.
What if an MNC wants the benefits of global sourcing without deploying billions in capital?
That is where contract manufacturing comes in. This is the act of selling or outsourcing the physical production facilities entirely to independent contractors.
So you let someone else build it.
Yes. It allows the firm to focus purely on its core competencies: R&D, design, and marketing. The source says this minimizes production costs, maintains quality, and increases the price-cost margin.
The semiconductor industry is the perfect proxy here. Look at a company like Apple or NVIDIA. They design the chips, they spend billions on the architecture and the software integration, but they do not own the hyper-expensive, multi-billion-dollar fabrication plants that physically print the silicon. They hand the blueprints over to a contract manufacturer like TSMC or Foxconn.
And the source maps out the specific value chain flow for this. It's a great sequence to memorize. It starts with the component supplier, who provides the raw materials. They sell to the subassembly manufacturer, who puts the basic pieces together.
Right.
They supply the contract manufacturer, who assembles the final finished product. And finally, that product is handed to the original equipment manufacturer, the OEM.
The OEM is the brand name on the box, so the OEM might never physically touch the product until it's wrapped in plastic.
Exactly. But operating a chain like that requires an astonishing level of trust and data integration. The source specifically highlights the absolute necessity of shared demand forecasting models.
Why is that so critical? I mean, why does the contractor need to know your internal sales forecast?
Because of the trust deficit. If you are the OEM and you secretly plan a massive Super Bowl ad campaign that's going to spike demand by 300%,
Yeah.
but you don't share that forecasting data with your contract manufacturer and your subassembly suppliers,
Oh, I see.
they won't buy enough raw materials, the ad runs, the customers try to buy the product, and the supply chain fractures. You have empty shelves. You have to integrate your IT system so the contract manufacturer can see your demand signals in real time.
So remind yourself for the exam. Choosing a wholly owned subsidiary over contract manufacturing is the ultimate test of how much control a company is willing to pay for. Contract manufacturing trades direct operational control for extreme capital efficiency and agility.
Perfectly summarized.
Which brings us to the payoff. Why do executives go through the agony of mapping multimodal transport, debating the GAO test, and setting up contract manufacturing networks? What is the measurable result that an MBA student needs to highlight in their final executive summary?
The whole point is to prove it makes money.
Right. The source text boils the strategic implications of outsourcing down to 3 core pillars: flexibility, cost reduction, and performance improvement.
Let's dissect the causality of each, because this is how you prove you understand the mechanics of profitability. First, flexibility.
By using contract manufacturers instead of owning factories, an MNC isn't anchored to one geographic location. If a tsunami hits a supplier in Asia, or a new government slaps a massive tariff on a specific country, the highly flexible MNC doesn't have to abandon a billion-dollar factory.
Right, they aren't trapped.
They simply shift their order volume dynamically to a different contract manufacturer in a different hemisphere. They achieve maneuverability through non-attachment.
Second, cost reduction. Vertical integration owning the whole chain creates massive bureaucratic complexity. You have to hire armies of middle managers, HR directors, and compliance officers just to run the factories. Outsourcing slices away all of that overhead. You are simply paying a negotiated unit price for a finished component.
And the third pillar, performance improvement, is where the real MBA magic happens. The text outlines an explicit causal chain here that you need to know.
Walk us through it.
By outsourcing, you radically reduce your capital expenditures. You take all that money you would have spent on factory upkeep and middle management, and you pour it into in-house R&D.
Innovation.
Exactly. That hyper-focused R&D budget leads to rapid product innovation. Because your product is highly innovative, it differentiates you from the competition. Differentiation means your product is less substitutable. Consumers can't just buy a cheaper knockoff because your tech is objectively better.
And because it's less substitutable, you gain pricing power.
You charge a premium, which results in higher overall profitability.
That is the holy grail. If you can articulate that exact macroeconomic chain reaction in an exam, from outsourcing to R&D reallocation to differentiation to decreased substitutability to premium pricing, you will absolutely ace the strategy section.
To give the listener an even stronger framework to present this, the source highlights the Arias-Aranda et al. 2011 framework. This study neatly divides the benefits of outsourcing into two distinct categories: organizational benefits and business benefits.
If you're building a slide deck for a board presentation, this is how you categorize your argument.
It separates the internal operational wins from the external financial wins.
Exactly. Under organizational benefits, we have internal improvements, shorter development cycles, gaining access to the latest technologies that the supplier has already funded, reducing your own internal training costs, improving your management processes.
And crucially, building entry barriers. If you lock up the best contract manufacturers with exclusive deals, your competitors literally cannot enter the market because there's nobody left to build their product.
And then you have the business benefits. These are the hard financial metrics, allowing the firm to focus exclusively on its core value-add activities, raw cost savings, getting rid of inefficient problem functions, and the most powerful financial lever of all, transferring fixed costs to variable costs.
Okay, we have to stop and unpack that.
Good.
Transferring fixed costs to variable costs. It sounds like dry accounting jargon, but it is the secret to corporate survival. Can we translate this into a real-world scenario?
Gladly. What's fascinating here is how it plays out in a crisis. Let's imagine a massive global recession hits. Consumer spending drops to near zero. A fixed cost is an expense you have to pay regardless of how many units you sell.
Like rent?
Right. If you decided to vertically integrate and own a massive EV factory, you have to pay the multi-million-dollar mortgage, the property taxes, the heating bill, and the security staff, even if you produce 0 cars that month. A fixed cost in a recession will bleed a company to death in weeks.
Because the cash is flowing out, but nothing is coming in.
Precisely. Now, look at a variable cost. A variable cost is an expense that only occurs when you actually produce and sell an item. If you used contract manufacturing, you don't pay the factory's mortgage. You don't pay their electric bill.
You only pay them when you issue a purchase order for a car.
Yes. So when the recession hits and demand drops to zero, your costs instantly drop to zero as well. You simply stop ordering. You have magically taken the catastrophic fixed cost of a factory and transformed it into a highly elastic variable cost that flexes perfectly with your revenue stream.
The vertically integrated company goes bankrupt, and the outsourced company simply hibernates until the economy recovers.
It's the ultimate defensive move.
That is an incredible way to conceptualize financial risk mitigation.
Yeah.
So listener, deploy the Arias-Aranda framework to show structured thinking and pound the table on that fixed to variable cost shift. But, as with any aggressive strategy, there is a dark side.
Always.
A brilliant MBA student doesn't just pitch the upside, they accurately forecast the catastrophic risks. We must address the limits to global sourcing.
A boardroom pitch without a risk mitigation strategy is just corporate daydreaming. The source makes it clear that outsourcing can severely harm the overall business and permanently damage a brand name if executed poorly.
The text leans heavily on Zhang and Tian's 2009 study, which categorizes these threats into 4 types of risk. Let's walk through them because this is your defensive playbook. Risk number 1, security risk. We often chase low costs into developing nations, but those locations can harbor immense political volatility.
Security risk is about exogenous shocks. Sudden changes in foreign policy, unexpected trade embargoes, or civil unrest. If your entire supply of critical components is sourced from a single politically unstable region, and a new regime decides to nationalize the factories or block exports.
Your global supply chain is severed overnight. You have no product to sell.
Exactly. Risk number 2, cost risk. This is the danger of hidden transaction costs. An executive looks at a spreadsheet, sees an hourly wage of $2 compared to $20 domestically, and thinks they're a genius. But what are they failing to account for?
The friction of distance and culture.
Right. Operating globally demands high local responsiveness. You have to hire translators, navigate opaque local legal systems, and adapt to different cultural working norms. Furthermore, the monitoring costs are astronomical.
You can't just trust a factory 10,000 miles away to self-report.
No. You have to constantly fly executives back and forth, hire local third-party quality auditors, and invest heavily in remote IT monitoring. When you tally up the travel, the audits, the delays, and the communication breakdowns, those hidden transaction costs can entirely wipe out the labor arbitrage you thought you were gaining.
Which leads directly into risk number 3, quality risk. This is the absolute nightmare scenario for any OEM. You contract out the manufacturing to save money. Because you are separated by oceans and monitoring is difficult, the contractor decides to secretly cut corners to pad their own margins.
They use a cheaper alloy. They skip a safety test. They fail to maintain standards.
And the consequences are existential. We have seen visceral, real-world examples of this. Offshore factories using toxic lead paint on children's toys, or sourcing faulty lithium-ion batteries that catch fire in people's pockets.
And when that happens, the consumer doesn't read the fine print to blame the anonymous contract manufacturer in another hemisphere. They look at the brand name stamped on the box, and they blame you.
So you go offshore to save a dime on assembly, and you permanently destroy a 100-year-old, billion-dollar brand reputation. It's like buying a discount parachute to save $50. The math simply doesn't justify the catastrophic downside.
This raises an important question for the exam. How does a manager balance the hard, highly visible cost savings on a quarterly spreadsheet against the invisible, unquantifiable, catastrophic risk of a brand-ruining quality failure?
Obviously.
You mitigate this through extreme vetting, redundant sourcing, and relentless auditing. And as a foundational tactic, the source advises signing shorter contracts. If a contractor starts cutting corners, you want the agility to sever the relationship quickly without being legally locked into a 10-year nightmare.
Good point. And finally, risk number 4, intellectual property right risk, or IPR risk. We touched on the defensive nature of vertical integration earlier. When you outsource, you are handing over your blueprints, your proprietary algorithms, and your specialized molds to a third party in a country that may have very weak legal enforcement.
The imitation risk is profound. You spend a decade and billions of dollars developing a revolutionary piece of tech. You send it offshore to be manufactured cheaply. 2 years later, the manager of that factory takes your schematics, walks across the street, opens a copycat facility, and starts flooding the global market with an identical product priced 50% cheaper under a different brand name.
The source notes that while the TRIPS Agreement of 2005 has strengthened global legal frameworks, the practical reality of enforcing IP theft in foreign jurisdictions remains incredibly difficult and expensive.
It's a huge gamble. By clearly articulating these 4 risks, security, cost, quality, and IPR, and attaching specific mitigation strategies like shorter contracts and diversified sourcing, you prove to your professor or your board that you aren't just blindly chasing cheap labor.
You are a sophisticated risk manager.
You're demonstrating executive judgment. You're showing that you understand the entire circulatory system.
Let's bring this all together. We have covered an immense amount of strategic ground today. We started by dismantling the myth that logistics is just forklifts and trucks, diving deep into the 8 processes that tie consumer demand forecasting and product design directly to warehouse efficiency.
The IKEA flat tack model.
Right. We explored the golden rule of trade, evaluating transportation costs against national price differences to locate resource versus market-oriented industries. We navigated the friction of global infrastructure, proving why road density and standard rail gauges matter for road flexibility.
We walked into the boardroom to debate make versus buy.
Yes, using the GAO's 3-part vulnerability test to definitively separate what should stay in-house versus what can be digitized and outsourced. We evaluated the China versus India dynamic, aligning infrastructure speed with technical software proficiency.
And we mapped the legal execution through Honda's wholly owned subsidiaries versus the semiconductor contract manufacturing models.
We quantified the strategic payoff using the area surrender framework, highlighting the magical shift from fixed to variable costs. And finally, we stared down the 4 existential risks of global sourcing from Jiang and Tian.
If you can synthesize those frameworks, if you can weave the bullwhip effect into the GAO vulnerability test, and if you can balance the variable cost savings against the catastrophic quality and IP risks, you will be unstoppable on your exams. You have the mental models of a true supply chain architect.
You are ready for the boardroom. But before we sign off, we want to leave you with one final thought, a provocation to push your strategic thinking past the textbook and into the future.
We spent a lot of time today debating the push and pull of making versus buying, but project this out a few decades. If technology continues to allow us to perfectly digitize, monitor, and separate even the most complex processes, and as developing nations rapidly upgrade their physical infrastructure to match the West, will there ever be a strategic reason for a multinational corporation to actually make anything themselves ever again?
No.
Or are we inevitably heading toward a future of entirely hollow global corporations? Entities that own 0 factories, employs zero physical laborers, and only exist as ethereal brands, algorithms, and ideas floating above a completely outsourced global manufacturing web.
A completely hollow corporation. The ultimate evolution of variable costs. That is a fascinating, slightly terrifying case study waiting to happen. We wish you the absolute best of luck on your upcoming MBA exams. You've got the tools, you've got the frameworks. Now go crush it. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.